Hello and welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. In today's video, we are going to do the economic future of China. And since China is such a big country with a lot of complexities, I figured I'd bring on a guest, Chris Street, to join us to discuss what's going on in China right now, especially with how international media has largely been closed off to the country. It's often difficult to discern that. So the first thing I want to ask Chris is, what are your overall thoughts on the economic future of China? Is it the next doomer country?
I would say, does the term bad, badder, and baddest, sort of sum up the problem that China has? China has a demographic bomb that exploded 10 years ago. In 2018, they had more people 65 and over than they had 18 and under. So China is a country that was, that originally it was expected they would lose up to half of their population by 2070. That could now happen by 2050.
Yeah, this year was the first year I think they've had a decline in population since the Great Leap Forward, if I'm not.
Well, yeah, remember that they had their census, and one of the problems with census is that they had 1.4 million people, only they couldn't find 100 million people, mostly young women, because they were aborted secretly. So when you look at the numbers of China, it's really closer to 1.3, 1.28. It is the first year that it theoretically is declining, but they forgot to tell you about the 100 million people they didn't have. Kind of like, you don't need to have an algorithm for this, you need arithmetic.
But
once a woman's over 40, not only does the desire, but the capability to have children diminishes rapidly.
So the next question then is, in the long term, the demographics seem to be a problem. But in the short term, there's a lot of hope, particularly among Wall Street, about this upcoming reopening of China's economy after they've been effectively locked down due to overbearing COVID restrictions for the last year and a half. So do you think that this is just going to be a sugar high, or is just going to be a resumption of pre-COVID trend growth in China?
Well, pre-COVID trend growth in China, was probably something like 4% to start with, instead of the 7 or 8 that they talk about, because they have this thing called, presenting your numbers to your boss. And if they turn out to be bad in China, there's real retaliation if you give me bad information. So it is most convenient in China to give me good information. So it's not that they lie at the top. They make sure that the information that comes to them is structured. So when you talk about China coming back, take a look at the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles. I mean, there are 49 berths, and 10 to 14 are filled on any given day, and usually one of those is a cruise ship and one's a tanker. So, where was this 3 years ago? I thought it was packed. You're kind of already past that, sugar high, because I think it already, to a great degree, already opened. They locked the people into the businesses. They started production. They made sure they got overtime and produced supply chain. Now the real issue is, can they sustain it?
So if that is the case, why have you seen such explosive rallies in China proxies such as iron ore futures, countries that exports rely on China, and copper, and retail outlets who have a large percentage of their stores in China, if there isn't anything to this reopening?
Well, I think you ran down your stocks, didn't you? I mean, when you sort of shut down the place, you ran down their inventory. So you had that bullwhip effect, where all of a sudden you've got to get a lot of iron ore, you got to get a lot of copper, you got to get a lot of everything. And then usually what happens is you get too much of it. And we saw a little bit of this at the end of last year in the United States, the first quarter, where people actually had too much in the way of inventory. So I think in China, I understand the statistics say one thing, and I'm saying a little bit of the other. I don't think we disagree. I just think the statistics that people get in China, they don't understand the process. So what would look like something in the United States is a trend, in China, it was a CCP decision.
So what would it take to get back to pre-COVID trend growth? The actual, not whatever the government was posting during the time. And is it what is it? And if it is possible, what is the pathway to do that?
Well, I think that they need to open immigration and take in 50 million people. Because culturally, that can never happen in China. It's a very inward-looking culture. They're very proud of their culture. They have a long history. But, in China, every time there's the end of a dynasty, 100 million people lose their head. Everybody associated with the last pattern, pretty much gets chopped off all the way down to their family member, and then we go forward. Xi Jinping understands China. He understands that China is never going to be a liberal democracy. And anytime that it is perceived that China is failing and the CCP is in power, it could be his family that's part of that 100 million heads.
So if China is not going to return to pre-COVID trend growth for an foreseeable future, then how long is it going to take for financial markets to realize that this reopening narrative is false? And what kind of data point would confirm to you that the reopening narrative is true, and what data points would have to come out to confirm that the reopening narrative is false?
Well, I get lots of information from people that actually run factories in China. And what I'm told is business is better, not this fantastic rebound people are talking about. Since the COVID started, we realized that there has this thing called competition. Take a look today at semiconductors. I thought semiconductors were going to be a disaster. We're not going to sell any of the high-end ones in China, and they've been shut down, so it's not available. I mean, we are flooded with medium and low-end semiconductors. There's too much supply and not enough demand. I mean, doesn't that tell you that one of the key processes in China, is already signaling lack of demand going forward?
So then, but I mean, I'm talking about just more about hard data in terms of economic things that the financial markets will recognize as this thing is not happening.
I think that's really the problem, Nick, is that real data isn't real. The data that Wall Street looks at, is very massaged. You can get this data if one of the best people I get it for is I pay $10,000 a year and get a Noto economics. You want to get detailed issues and of China, pay $10,000 and I'll get you some people who really understand what's going on the ground, and and they work for the multinationals. It's an expensive online service, and I think it's worth every penny. But remember that China is a banking story, not necessarily a production story. China had tremendous savings that was prevented from going into international markets. So it went into their bank system. And if it goes in their bank system with fractional banking, the banking system of China, as far as deposits, got larger than, I would say the EU and maybe Japan together. And when you have that kind of a concentration of deposits, fractional banking can leverage it way, way up, right? But they never had Dodd-Frank in China. They never had a requirement to deleverage the banking system down to, essentially something like 13 to 1. That's what America's banking system was, deleveraged down from 25 to 1 to 13 to 1. That means from 25 dividing into 100 cents means 4 cents of collateral, down to closer to 7 cents of collateral. In China, it is officially 3 cents of collateral and probably more like 2. So this multiplier on the way up is now becoming a multiplier on the way down. So the government is allowing greater and greater amounts of leverage in organizations like local government, which historically have been, the biggest part of the problem. They have, they've whipped the banks into doing transactions. So I think that they've sort of played out that game to the extreme. I believe there's something like 90 million empty apartments in China. Now, remember, an empty apartment in China means somebody owns it. But the way it works is when you buy an apartment, you don't buy the apartment, you buy the right to lease it for 70 years. And the common trait is I don't get rent on that because I don't actually put anybody in there. I don't think that there's any more bandwidth for the banks to expand and the real estate to expand. And the more the real estate expands, the more collateral the banks have, the more you expand the economy. So I think that that escalator is turning into the express elevator on the downside.
And then also the other question is from the longer term health of China's economy. How much is the lying flat movement affecting things, and how strong is the lying flat movement? We saw a lot about it in the news last summer, but I haven't really seen any updates on it since.
Well, this is the problem. In China, they are desperate for competent workers. The problem is, they're going to lose, something around 20 million per year. These are people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s that actually know how to do something, very skilled, and they hit 65, and in China, they smoke, they have bad diet, they have all that kind of stuff. So their longevity, is curtailed by the customs, the food, and the rest of it. So these people who are lying flat, these young people, they don't have productive skills. They can't come in immediately and create, some advantage to a company. The companies were, the attitude was the companies take them and carry them, and then eventually they, take the spot of the guy above them and above. But I think it's not expanding, and lying flat doesn't necessarily, mean they have no ambition. It means they have little or no opportunity.
I thought it was more of a voluntary opt-out for people working at tech companies like Alibaba because of the work culture and the relative low pay versus housing costs and other expenses needed to get married. Or is I off?
I'm not buying that. In China, one of the problems if you're going to get married is you got to buy the wife.
Yeah, you got to buy a house, and if you're making only $2,000 a month, you can't afford that. So what's the point?
Well, you have to buy the wife too. In the old days, you married a woman, you got a dowry. In the modern days, you got to pay up in most cases. You got to, the family expects to get something. If they've carried this daughter, which will never be a retirement fund for them, they really expect to get money. You got to give them something. So there's, one of the problems of having families is how many women are there to men? I think it's 1.4, 1.5 men to women.
Statistic I saw was about 1.17.
No, much higher than that. Much higher than that. I'm talking about those in the marriable category.
So like 20 to 40. Then it may
about 1.2 to well closer to 1.4. I think you knock it down from there. But the bottom line to it is, there's too many men and not enough women, and the women don't have to. They can choose lifestyle changes because they have an opportunity to shop who they're going to be with. Part of that is I don't want to work in a assembly line. I want to be a homemaker. That's a big in China. If you have your child or two childs and you take care of the house and you don't have to work like everybody else, it's quite compelling. But as I said, it is. There's a limited stock of that. There's a limited opportunity. Everything is expensive. If your parents don't provide you that apartment, and you're a regular person, as you said, you got to go out and pay for it. All of this is economics 101 for failure.
So how is this going to affect the population chart? Is it going to accelerate the demographic decline?
Well, I think it is in the demographic. It's not that they're lazy. It's not that they're different. It's just this is the world that's presented to them. I mean, if I'm a tech worker and I'm working, 15 hours, 16 hours a day rather, and 6 days a week is common, and I have zero upside, I'm probably going to play some video games and hang out. Maybe it'd be nice to go sleep in my parents' house. Whatever the deal is, there's just not the normal reward structure, or the rewards are beyond my means and capability. I mean, you've got to, if you're one of those people that is making big money, well, everything comes to you. But if you make just regular money and you're not the most attractive guy, and you don't have the best parents, you don't have the best, gifts to give, you're kind of not going to have those rewards.
I mean, does this impact political stability at all?
What do you think they're hammering down? I mean, in China, they're hammering, the Alibaba guys and things like that. People, the rich are supposed to now give back, I forget what the term they use for it. It's not government share. There's a term they give where you're supposed to donate back to the Chinese government a portion of your company. That's
the wealth tax, basically.
Well, it's just, there are alternatives, to not doing that, which are all bad. So call it a wealth tax or call it a expropriation, but that's the game.
And then the other question I have for the long-term future of China, because I did a report about the economic future of Taiwan about 4 months ago. And you look at the GDP per capita of Taiwan versus the GDP per capita of the mainland since the departure of Mao, and Taiwan has accelerated a lot faster, and as their living standards are over 3 times that of the mainland. And the only real difference are the same people pretty much in terms of culture and ethnicity and history up to that point, up to the revolution and the wars. But Taiwan's economy is a lot more prosperous, and the average living standards are in line with most first world countries, where that is not the same in China. Could you argue that the CCP itself is the reason why that China's economic performance has not been even better? And would China be a more prosperous and geopolitically dangerous country if it was run more like Taiwan?
There was a vacation from communism, that allowed this sort of economic entrepreneurial spirit to flourish. But even during this, entrepreneurial spirit that flourished, remember what they started with. When the Chinese communists won, they really won, with the people in the rural areas coming in to fight the people in the cities. Mao originally was an elitist and had a rebellion in 1928 in the cities, and they absolutely got stopped because city people have things to lose, and they don't want to fight to the bitter end, the way that rural people. Remember, he went through his long march, and then he organized the countryside, and the countryside, the 100 years of shame in China were 100 years of shame in China for the countryside. But if you took a look at the port cities, the Guangzhous, the Hong Kongs, the Shanghais, it was glorious riches and fun, when they were doing this interface with the Western world. They had this great business that was just absolutely booming. You had about 20% of the Chinese society that loved the foreigners because we would trade with them. That was a great opportunity and a great wealth builder. But the other 80% of the country on the rural suffered badly because they were the donkeys for that structure. So as the revolution was succeeding, remember that in 1947 the communists had been beaten, and it looked like the Kuomintang, which is the old party, what was in the process of defeating them, and just almost exactly like Cuba, they went too far, stretched their lines of supply out too far, and got beat. And what looked like a great victory for the United States foreign policy, in stuffing the Chinese and China, flipped. And so it happened so fast, and they headed for the cities. If you were in the cities, you knew you were going to go to re-education camps. And so a lot of those very productive, educated, elitist people, they all got in a boat and went to Taiwan. Seeding that kind of population, would create a boom anywhere in the world.
So you're saying it's a immigration selection bias that explains Taiwan's performance.
It's a good way to put it, isn't it? We instead of taking the low, we take the high.
Well, I'm also going to explain the success of the United States too, in a way. Like, well, at least with legal immigration, we tend to take the top people from a lot of other countries.
Right. Well, the United States is different because the United States has what no other country in the world has. We have water everywhere. We have resources everywhere. We're just not like anybody else. We're this island, with the largest amount of water, usage per person on the planet by far. And that pretty much, makes up for a lot of the selection errors and things like that. I mean, we're still, if you took a look at the United States, the carrying capacity of the United States is probably at least twice what it is right now. You go to places like Europe and in China, where you have this only, what they call the 15-inch isoset line, that line where water, you get rainfall of 15 inches or more on this side, that's only about 40% of the country.
Yeah. That's also, they have a similar thing. I think it's the 100th meridian in the U.S.
Right, exactly.
Like
In the United States,
80% of the population lives east of that.
Well, on one side of the population, the 100th meridian in the United States, you have rain and on the other side, you have 15 to 20 inches of rain. That's above the 15-inch sort of, you can't grow crops. So you can grow crops there, but you also have gigantic aquifers under the United States, and you can drill for them. So pretty much that 1,000 square mile block of the United States, can grow things or raise animals easily compared to the rest of the world.
So back to China. So, like, if China adopted something more like a multi-party state, would it be viable there?
For about an hour and a half.
And why do you say
revolutionary? That? It would be revolutionary.
But why would it fail?
Well, because you would take the cork out of the bottle to do that. And then all of this history of China, all of these disparate, China used to have like 7 different, warlords, and, they'd get along and then they'd fight, and then they'd get along and then they'd fight, and then they'd, each time they'd fight, somebody, one part of them would get killed, and then you get the Chinese communists were the first people that actually, killed all of the warlords and then turned around and installed their own warlords. Remember Tiananmen Square? The protests in Tiananmen Square in China. There was an army coming from the south that was actually marching towards Beijing, and they cut a deal, and those people went back to barracks. But China still is very difficult to control. It is it is not going to be a liberal democracy. That would just be, unless you're willing to let them fight it out for 20 years or so, and then we'll get down to what can be a liberal democracy. I think that they're going to be a dictatorial state in between periods of chaos.
Yeah, but I could see where you're coming from with the history of their dynastic politics, but how come every other country in East Asia, with the exception of North Korea, has been able to transition to a more democratic society?
Well, I think part of that also has to do with the fact that they had an enemy. Remember that this was the gig, right? that the United States created the New World Order after World War II. And in the New World Order, we were looking for teams that hadn't picked a side. About a third of the world had gone communist. And, the United States woke up one day and said, how'd this happen? After China flipped, they adopted a strategy to use the United States Navy and use the United States resources. We had about 60% of all the gold in the world, 62%, I think it is, after World War II. And we created these, we created Bretton Woods, and we created these ABC institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the Bank for International Settlements. And we seeded this with golden power, but it was really the United States golden power. And at one point, I think we had, real forces in 152 countries. You look at the deployments now, we still have a lot of places that we call deployments, but we don't have that kind of, we haven't had that kind of, manning out there for 30 years. And our Navy, there was a day when, aircraft carriers, just a few of them could control the world. They're kind of like sitting ducks now. I mean, they're just not as dominant as they were. And pretty much what's happening is America is going back home, and the New World Order is dying because it's not valuable to the United States. If it's not valuable to the United States, start watching what happens to these societies in Asia that you think now are liberal democracies. We'll see what happens.
So then, speaking of the U.S. pulling back, how is China going to adapt to onshoring by America and its allies?
Complete disaster. It's already in the process of happening. As I said, remember semiconductor chips were supposed to be supposed to end, the tech industry in the United States. Without China, now you have too many chips, and pretty soon you're going to have too many high-end chips. And then, what's going to happen? You're going to have higher-end chips than higher-end chips. So, the tech industry replatforms every 3 to 5 years. They have modern factories, not because they want to, but because they have to. So, you can put these, you can change your mind pretty damn fast. And what we're seeing right now is already playing forward that companies are not so sure that China is the future, and have at least, diversified, their production, if not a lot of them moving to India, and more importantly, moving back to North America. I think it was 2019, Mexico became the largest trading partner of the United States. That in the future is North America.
So then, are you basically, just seems like it's pretty doom and gloom with your outlook for China. And it basically seems like to me, and this is what the financial markets are implying through PE ratios of Chinese stocks right now, is that China is going to turn into what happened to Russia prior to its invasion of Ukraine.
Well, I think that part of that story is true. The consumer market of Russia, that Russia is going to be a source of low labor costs, and would be part of the supply chain for Europe, was a big disaster. I mean, Putin, was a member of the KGB, and he was driving a taxi at night and living with his parents, right? He and his wife, because they were that low. The idea that you would turn them into a liberal democracy and they would have, consumption like the rest of the world, was a complete failure. Russia flipped, and this has been the big aha moment for American foreign policy. Russia flipped back to being a successful resource-based economy. And that's turned out to be very compelling. And in the future, it probably is resources that are, the currency of the future. It's not necessarily semiconductor chips.
Yeah, but China doesn't have enough natural resources to support its own production and feed its own population. So
That's right. That's exactly right. Without trade, China is done. Um, and they can huff and puff and do all that kind of stuff, but the bottom line to it is they'll never get past the Malaccan Straits, right? They'll never get. I mean, to go to invade Taiwan, you'd have to cross 120 miles of water. We're not talking about paratroopers. Millions of paratroopers coming in the sky. Those things would be blown out. They have the equivalent of shotgun type weapons that would blow out every kind of air transport coming over. So you have to come over by water, and coming over by water, you'd lose almost everybody on the way over. So I'm not saying that China won't try, because the problem China has, it's in a revolutionary environment, and they may need to try. But if China tries and the CCP fails, well, that revolution then turns on them. So I don't think there's any real answer for China's problem other than the die-off that's taking place right now. Remember that if they lose half their population, even if they're older, they'll have half the number of people to feed. I mean, that's the Malthusian.
well, if China needs resources, why don't
right?
they just go and march on the Russian Far East? They outnumber them 15-1.
Anybody who underestimates the Russian, it's been to their doom. It's the Russians probably, and I'm older than you are. I have been involved in a lot of technology issues and such like that. I want to tell you, if you didn't have the Cold War, Soviet Union scientists would have probably won most of the Nobel Prizes in physics. Of course, they couldn't publish, right? But this is a country, a very well-educated country, with a long history of science and technology. And the things they made were straight up to the United States in the Cold War, right? As far as technology, what did they steal them, or did they get them, or did they make them? I think all of the above. I mean, remember that the United States and all of Europe just had a financial war with China. And I think at this point, it's fair to say that the United States and Europe ran out of tools. They haven't lost the financial war yet, but they're closer to losing the financial war than putting Russia back in a trash compactor.
So then, based on all you're saying, what is your outlook for China in next year, in 2025, and then 2030 and beyond?
Well, I think for the next 2 years, you could get a good economic bounce. You're going to see. I always watch the CSI 300, because that is those are the 300 companies that the CCP cares about the price, and if they've started to trade up on it. You've seen a breakout here. I mean, it's the perfect basket for a technician to trade off of, because it is policy oriented. If the government decides they want all of the pension plans to put money in those stocks, up they go. And that's been the policy in the last 3 months. They just broke out. It took a while to turn it around, but this is the last mating call of the dinosaurs before the meteor augers in.
And you expect that to hit mid-decade?
I think that's going to hit within 2 years. I think that there'll be a radical, and then all hell breaks loose. Either breaks loose internally, externally, whatever that hell is this time. You're coming up to that event. I mean, I don't doubt they could think about invading Taiwan, for the simple fact that it's a value to have a good distraction, right? I mean, they need something tremendous to convince the people, that they're melting away. And if you're a young person, maybe you're laying flat right now. But laying flat people have a nasty habit of eventually turning into revolutionaries. They get mad, they get angry, they get mean, they get resentful, they get even.
So now that we've kind of covered everything on China and California, do you have any final notes or things you'd like to say about the economic future of China before we wrap this up?
China's going to go through 10 to 12 years of total crisis. If they somehow manage to compress it and stop it from turning into violent revolution, they will have been artful. Normally, these things are nasty, and then it'll kind of reprogram itself and come back kind of to the way it was from the 1850s to the 1930s, when you had the coastal cities, which are very productive and and modern, and you have the interior, which is very interior and not modern. And I think on a population crash, there's a carrying capability for China. I know people don't read about Malthus and people like that anymore. We're in the modern world where somebody's able to move the levers and we get the answers. I don't think there's levers and answers here.
All right. Thank you for joining us, Chris. And we look forward to having you back in the future.
Thanks a lot, Nick.